Sarah stood in the courthouse hallway at 7:45 a.m., 20 minutes before her custody hearing was scheduled to begin. Her reflection in the polished glass doors showed a woman she barely recognized, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back severely, wearing a charcoal business suit that suddenly felt like armor. At 42 years old, she looked exhausted in a way that no amount of concealer could hide. Beside her, 3-year-old Emma sat on a wooden bench, swinging her tiny legs back and forth, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since infancy. The rabbit had a name, Mr. Floppy, and Emma whispered to it constantly, as if seeking reassurance from the only being who wouldn't judge her or complicate her world. The custody battle had begun 18 months ago, but the real deterioration of Sarah's marriage had started long before that. She and had married 12 years ago in a rush of passion and optimism. He was a successful real estate developer with charisma and ambition. She was a rising healthcare administrator with dreams of making a difference in hospital management. For the first 5 years, they were happy, or at least, they told themselves they were. They talked about children in abstract terms, always someday, and when we're more settled. Then Emma arrived unexpectedly, a beautiful accident that neither had planned but both pretended to welcome. Everything changed the moment Emma was born. Sarah, already working 60-hour weeks, suddenly found herself juggling motherhood with ambition. She'd read all the books about work-life balance and felt simultaneously that she was succeeding at everything and failing at everything. Meanwhile, seemed to resent the intrusion. He'd never been particularly maternal or paternal, really. Emma represented chaos to him, unpredictable crying, disrupted sleep schedules, canceled plans, and a wife who suddenly had divided attention. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, staying late at the office, taking business trips that extended longer than necessary, building a separate life that Emma couldn't infiltrate. The fight started small. Sarah would ask him to pick up Emma from, and he'd claim an emergency meeting came up. She'd request he spend time with their daughter on Saturday mornings, and he'd mention golf plans that had been made forever. Began to criticize Sarah's parenting choices. She was too strict with Emma, or conversely, too lenient. She wasn't teaching her proper values. She was pushing too hard in the school's programs. She was too focused on her career and not present enough. These criticisms stung because Sarah already felt inadequate, already questioned whether she could truly have it all. By year 10 of their marriage, they were living separate lives under one roof, spent most nights in the guest bedroom, claiming he didn't want to disturb Sarah's sleep schedule. Communication devolved into logistics, whose turn to pick up Emma, whether the nanny could stay late, arguing about her preschool tuition. There was no intimacy, no laughter, no partnership. Sarah found herself becoming resentful of how little engaged with their daughter. She'd watch him scroll through his phone while Emma tried to show him her drawings, and her heart would break for their child. When Sarah finally asked for the divorce, seemed almost relieved. But then his lawyer called, and everything shifted into warfare. Had hired one of the most ruthless family law attorneys in the state. His strategy was clear from the opening salvo: paint Sarah as a neglectful, career-obsessed mother who prioritized her job over her daughters. Had hired a private investigator to document Sarah's work hours, her after-work social engagements, and the frequency with which Emma was in or with the nanny. The evidence was damning. Sarah often worked until 6 p.m., sometimes later. She attended professional conferences that took her out of state for 3 days at a time. She'd gone out for drinks with colleagues on 3 separate occasions in the past 6 months. Meanwhile, positioned himself as the devoted father. He suddenly became available for Emma's school activities. He showed up at her ballet classes with a camera, filming every moment. He took photographs at the park and posted them on social media with captions about quality father-daughter time. He enrolled her in extra activities and made sure to be photographed at each one. To outside observers, he appeared to be the engaged parent, while Sarah looked like she was choosing her career over her child. The financial reality made everything worse. earned significantly more than Sarah in his real estate business. He could afford the best lawyers. Sarah had to carefully budget for hers. He could take time off work. Sarah couldn't afford to. His lawyer filed motion after motion, each one requesting custody modifications. Sarah found herself constantly reactive, always defending her parenting choices instead of living her life. Now, sitting in this hallway, Sarah felt the weight of 18 months of litigation crushing down on her. The custody arrangements had gradually shifted in his favor. What started as standard shared custody had become a 60-40 arrangement favoring him. Emma had begun acting out, refusing to go to preschool, having accidents in her pants despite being nearly potty trained, waking up with night terrors. A child psychologist Sarah had hired privately suggested Emma was experiencing anxiety from the custody battles and the instability of constant transitions between households. Sarah's lawyer Thomas approached her with coffee and a grim expression. "Judge is on the bench today," he said quietly. "She's tough but fair. However, I need to be honest. The evidence we're presenting about your work schedule is going to be challenged hard, has built a narrative that's difficult to counter." Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew he was right. All the logic in the world couldn't change the fact that she worked long hours. All her intentions and her love for Emma couldn't compete with his carefully curated image of devoted fatherhood. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mommy, is Daddy coming?" Sarah's heart shattered. Even Emma had internalized the narrative that this was a conflict, that her parents were opponents rather than partners in raising her. She didn't understand that the real issue wasn't who worked more or who was better at parenting. The real issue was that had weaponized fatherhood as a cudgel against Sarah's ambitions. "Let's go inside, baby," Sarah said, taking Emma's hand and Mr. Floppy. As they walked toward the courtroom doors, she sent a silent prayer to a universe she didn't believe in, hoping that somehow, someone would see that she loved her daughter with every fiber of her being, even if it didn't fit neatly into anyone's definition of a perfect mother. Thomas sat across from Sarah in his modest law office, the afternoon light casting long shadows across his desk. It was Friday, 4 days before the custody hearing, and they had precious little to work with. He'd been reviewing the case files for the 100th time, searching for an angle, any angle, that might shift Judge's perspective. The statistical reality weighed heavily on both of them. Judges rarely ruled against fathers who presented themselves as engaged and devoted parents, especially when the mother's work schedule provided such an easy target. Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "We're going to lose, aren't we?" Sarah asked quietly. She wasn't looking for false reassurance. She was looking for truth. After 18 months of litigation, she could read his expressions better than she could read her own. "Without something significant, yes," Thomas admitted. He'd never been one to sugarcoat things, which was partly why Sarah had hired him. His narrative is simple and compelling. You work too much. He doesn't. Therefore, he should have more custody. The judge has shown she's conservative on these matters. She believes children need stability and presence, and right now appears to provide both. Sarah felt tears threatening but forced them back. She had to stay composed, had to think strategically. "What about my references? I have 3 teachers from Emma's preschool willing to testify that she's well-adjusted, that I'm an engaged mother." "I know," Thomas interrupted gently. "And that helps. But's lawyer will counter with his own witnesses. The nanny who has apparently befriended that family friend who swears he's the most devoted father she's ever met. It becomes a he said she said argument, and judges don't like those. They want hard evidence patterns, something tangible." Sarah felt desperation rising in her chest like floodwater. She'd done everything right, hired the best attorney she could afford, documented her involvement in Emma's life meticulously, kept a calendar of every school pickup, every bedtime story, every moment. And yet it wasn't enough. The system felt rigged in favor of whoever could afford the best narrative construction. "What about the behavioral issues?" Sarah ventured. "The psychologist's report about Emma's anxiety." Also helpful, Thomas said, but it could cut both ways. Attorney will argue that your long work hours are causing Emma stress, that she needs more stability and a parent who's more available. You see, even our strongest evidence becomes ammunition against us. They sat in heavy silence for several minutes. Sarah stared out the window at the parking lot below, watching people go about their normal lives. Somewhere out there, parents and children were having uncomplicated relationships. Somewhere, people weren't fighting in courtrooms over love and custody. Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then suddenly straightened in his chair. Wait, Emma's in that Pause and Peace program at school, isn't she? Sarah looked up, confused by the shift in his tone. Yes, why? Tell me about it. Sarah described how she'd enrolled Emma in the program 6 months ago, desperate to help her daughter manage the anxiety that had manifested since the custody battles began. The program was a pilot initiative, still somewhat experimental, that brought certified therapy dogs to schools once a week. Children spent 30 minutes interacting with the dogs, petting them, walking them on leashes, sitting with them during quiet time. Emma had been resistant at first, but after 2 sessions, something clicked. The transformation was remarkable. Emma actually looks forward to going to school now, Sarah explained, her voice warming as she spoke about it. She talks about the dog, his name is Duke, a golden retriever, constantly. She asks if we can visit him. She's drawn pictures of him. It's literally the only thing that makes her excited anymore. When I drop her off and she knows Duke will be there, she doesn't cry. She doesn't cling to me. She just runs to the door. I haven't seen her that happy in months. Thomas was leaning forward now, his eyes sharp and focused. Who runs the program? A police officer named David. He's a K-9 handler with the police department. He trains Duke as both an evidence dog and a therapy animal. Mr. seems incredible, very patient with the kids, very committed to helping them through the program. Thomas stood up and began packing. Sarah watched him, trying to understand where he was going with this. Sarah, what if we called and Duke as witnesses? I'm sorry, what? Think about it, Thomas said, his excitement building. We don't call them as traditional witnesses. We introduce them as part of demonstrating your commitment to Emma's emotional. You enrolled her in a therapeutic program. You recognized her anxiety and took proactive steps. That's engaged parenting. That's a mother who pays attention to her child's needs. Sarah shook her head. But attorney will object. They'll say it's theatrical, that it's manipulation. Probably, Thomas acknowledged. But I want Judge to see Emma's genuine reaction to something that matters to her. And I want her to understand that you put Emma in this program specifically because you recognized her emotional needs. That's not the action of a neglectful parent. That's a mother who's attentive, who's proactive, who's thinking about her daughters beyond just the logistical aspects of. Sarah felt a fragile spark of hope ignite in her chest. Do you really think it could work? No, Thomas said honestly, but I think it's our only shot. The worst that happens is Judge denies the request and we proceed as planned. But if she allows it, if she sees Emma's face light up, if she understands that you're the parent who recognized Emma needed this kind of support, it might be enough to create reasonable doubt about's narrative. He pulled out his phone and searched for information about the Pause and Peace program. Within minutes, he'd found officers' contact information through the police department website. I'm going to call him today. I need to explain the situation and see if he'd be willing to participate. I need to be honest with him about why we're asking. Do you think he'll agree? Sarah asked. I don't know, Thomas said, but strikes me as someone who cares about kids. If he understands that Emma's might depend on this, that there's a chance her father could gain more custody despite concerning circumstances, I think he might consider it. This isn't about winning a case for us. It's about a child's safety and... Sarah felt tears flow freely now, but these were different tears. These were tears of possibility, of someone actually fighting for her. She thought about Emma's face that morning, the way she'd clutched Mr. Floppy, the anxiety in her small voice. Whatever happened in that courtroom, whatever judge decided, Sarah needed to know that she'd done everything possible. "Call him," she said. "Please call him today." Thomas nodded and immediately dialed. As the phone rang, Sarah held her breath. This was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary thrown into the darkness. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Sarah had run out of conventional options. The conversation that was about to happen would set events in motion that no one in that law office could possibly anticipate. A therapy dog, a 3-year-old girl, and a moment of unexpected honesty would soon collide in ways that would change everything. The courtroom was packed when they reconvened on Tuesday morning. Word had somehow spread that something unusual was happening in Judge's courtroom. A therapy dog was being introduced as evidence in a custody case. Court officers stood near the back, and several lawyers passing through the halls had positioned themselves in the gallery, curious about this unconventional strategy. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with Thomas, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the wooden surface. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind cycling through every possible outcome, every way this could backfire catastrophically. Sat at the defense table with his attorney, looking supremely confident. Had filed his objection to the introduction of the therapy dog immediately upon receiving notice. His argument was predictable, theatrical manipulation designed to obscure the fundamental issues of the case. He'd written in his motion that introducing an animal into judicial proceedings was unprofessional, that it was an attempt to emotionalize a decision that should be based on facts and schedules and financial capacity. He'd cited precedents and legal standards. Judge had read his objection, and his face had shown triumph. Surely the judge would agree that this was an overreach. But Judge had surprised them all. She'd allowed it, not with enthusiasm but with measured curiosity. "I'm going to permit this introduction," she'd written in her ruling. "However, I am warning counsel that if this becomes anything resembling a circus, I will clear the courtroom and strike all testimony related to this witness from the record. Proceed with caution." Emma sat between Sarah and the gallery railing, still in her best pink dress, the one she'd worn to her cousin's wedding 6 months ago. The dress was getting tight. Emma was growing so fast, and Sarah had had to use an extender in the back to make it fit. Her daughter kept kicking her feet, nervous energy coursing through her small body. She didn't understand why they were here, why the courtroom was so formal and quiet, why her daddy was sitting at a different table looking angry. "When do we do the thing?" Emma whispered to Sarah, her voice small and uncertain. "Soon, baby," Sarah whispered back, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Just be yourself, okay? That's all you need to do." Judge entered, and everyone stood. She was a woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair and an expression that revealed nothing. She'd been on the bench for 23 years and had heard thousands of custody cases. Most of them blurred together, parents fighting, children caught in the middle, everyone claiming they had the child's best interests at heart while actually pursuing their own agendas. She settled into her high-backed chair and surveyed the courtroom with evident disapproval at the standing-room-only crowd. "I see word has gotten out," she said dryly. "For the record, this is still a custody proceeding, not a circus performance. Anyone who cannot maintain appropriate courtroom decorum will be removed." She looked directly at the gallery. Silence. Then she turned to Thomas. "Counsel, you may proceed with your witness." Thomas stood. "Your Honor," the plaintiff calls Officer David and K9 Duke to the stand. A door at the side of the courtroom opened, and Officer David walked through, leading Duke on a leather leash. The dog was stunning, a golden retriever with a glossy coat, alert amber eyes, and an air of calm professionalism. He wore his official police vest, embroidered with K9 Duke Therapy and Evidence. Officer was a man in his early 40s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to working with both children and dangerous situations. He moved with quiet confidence toward the witness stand. That's when everything changed. Emma's entire body went rigid. Her eyes widened to enormous circles. Her mouth fell open, and for a moment she seemed unable to breathe. Then recognition crashed through her like a wave. She stood up on the bench, nearly losing her balance, and pointed at Duke with an intensity that seemed to shake the entire courtroom. "Duke, Duke," she screamed, her voice high and clear and filled with a joy so pure and uncomplicated that it seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. "Duke is here! Duke is here!" Sarah's eyes filled with tears immediately. This was the Emma she knew, animated, alive, full of genuine happiness. Not the anxious, withdrawn child who'd been appearing in their home for the past months. This was Emma before the custody battles, before the stress, before the constant uncertainty. This was Emma at her core. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and electric. Several people in the gallery actually gasped. One lawyer put his hand over his mouth. His face had gone slightly red, his jaw clenching, even looked momentarily disconcerted. Judge leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing with interest. She was watching Emma with the intensity of a predator studying prey, but not predatory in a harmful way. She was truly observing, truly seeing this child's authentic response. Officer smiled warmly. "Well, hello, Emma," he said, his voice soft and professional. He began walking Duke slowly through the courtroom, positioning the dog so Emma could see him clearly. Duke's tail wagged with recognition. The dog remembered this little girl from their weekly sessions at school. He was happy to see her. "Good boy, good boy, good boy," Emma sang out, clapping her hands together. She bounced on the bench, her pink dress bouncing with her. Sarah reached out to steady her, but she was smiling so hard she thought her face might crack. This was what she'd been trying to tell everyone. This was who Emma was when she wasn't afraid, when she felt safe and happy and supported. "Counsel," Judge said quietly, "you may proceed with your examination of the officer." But everyone in that courtroom, including the judge, was still watching Emma. The child had settled back into her seat, never taking her eyes off Duke. She was transfixed, completely engaged, utterly present in a way she hadn't been since before the custody battles began. Sarah watched her daughter's face and saw the tension melt away. Emma's shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. The anxiety that had become her constant companion seemed to evaporate in the presence of this dog. Thomas began his questioning. "Officer, could you tell the court about the Pause and Peace program and Emma's participation in it?" "Of course," responded. He explained the program, how it worked, what benefits had been documented, how Emma had been anxious when she first started but had blossomed over the past 6 months. He spoke about how children often express emotions through animals that they struggle to express through words. He discussed the therapeutic value of the human-animal bond, citing research and statistics, all while Duke sat peacefully beside him, occasionally glancing back at Emma with gentle eyes. But the real testimony was happening silently, Emma's transformation, visible to everyone in the courtroom. This was a child who was safe and happy in the presence of an animal that her mother had been wise enough to introduce into her life. This was not the behavior of a child being neglected or poorly parented. This was the behavior of a child who was being seen, heard, and supported by a mother who paid attention to her emotional needs. Even as Thomas finished his questioning and began his cross-examination, attempting to argue that the dog was merely a distraction, a manipulation of the facts, everyone could see that something fundamental had shifted in that courtroom. Judge's expression had changed. She was looking at Emma with new understanding, as if seeing the real stakes of this case for the first time, not as abstract legal arguments about work hours and schedules, but as a child's actual unhappiness. When Officer was finally excused and walked Duke back toward the door, Emma's face fell. She reached toward them, her hands stretching out desperately. "Duke, wait," she cried. Officer paused and turned back. He walked Duke one more time past the bench where Emma sat, allowing her to reach out and touch his soft golden coat one final time. It was a small gesture, but it was the last thing anyone needed to see. A 3-year-old girl, connected to an animal that made her feel safe, cared for, and loved. As the day continued, everyone knew that Judge's decision had already been made. The courtroom seemed to settle into an uneasy silence after Officer and Duke left. Judge had called for a brief recess, ostensibly to allow everyone to regain their composure, but Sarah suspected the judge needed time to process what had just transpired. The entire trajectory of the hearing had shifted. Whereas attorney had seemed supremely confident that morning, now he looked troubled, whispering furiously with his client at the defense table. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Sarah remained at her seat, Emma snuggled against her side. She didn't want to let her daughter go, didn't want to risk Emma's mood shifting, didn't want this moment of clarity to fade. Emma had gone quiet after Duke left, not anxious quiet but peaceful quiet, as if the dog's presence had soothed something deep within her. Thomas had excused himself to use the restroom, but he returned quickly, settling back into his seat with a slight smile. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both understood that something had fundamentally changed. "Sarah," Emma whispered, tugging on her mother's sleeve, "can we see Duke again?" "I don't know, baby," Sarah said honestly. "Maybe we'll have to wait and see what the judge decides." Emma seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to her quiet contemplation. But Sarah could feel her daughter's anxiety beginning to creep back in, the anxiety that was always lurking beneath the surface these days. She held Emma closer, rubbing small circles on her daughter's back, trying to project calm and safety. Judge returned to the bench exactly 15 minutes later. The courtroom stood. She surveyed the room with that penetrating gaze and settled back into her chair. "We will continue with the examination of the plaintiff," she announced. "Counsel, do you have additional witnesses?" "Your Honor," Thomas said, standing, "I would like to call Sarah back to the stand for redirect examination." Sarah felt a spike of anxiety. She'd already extensively on the first day. What did Thomas want to ask her now? But she followed his unspoken direction and made her way to the stand, carefully orchestrating Emma's seating with the bailiff so her daughter could remain in the gallery close to her. Emma watched her mother with worried eyes as Sarah was sworn in again. Thomas approached, and his first question surprised her. "Ms., when you enrolled Emma in the Pause and Peace program, what specific behavioral changes prompted that decision?" Sarah found herself describing Emma's anxiety in detail. The nightmares, the regression in potty training, the way Emma would cling to her during custody transitions, the sudden shyness with people who'd never seemed to bother her before. As she spoke, she watched Judge taking notes, her expression growing more serious. This was the testimony that mattered, not the legalistic arguments about work hours, but the observable reality of a child in distress. "And when Emma began attending the program," Thomas continued, "what changes did you observe?" "Immediate and significant improvement," Sarah said. "Within 2 weeks she stopped having nightmares. Within a month the daytime anxiety had decreased noticeably. She started going to school without crying. She became more animated, more like herself." "And why do you think the dog made such a difference?" "Because Emma felt safe," Sarah said simply. "Because she had someone, that was consistent and comforting and didn't judge her or make her anxious. Because animals don't carry the complexity that humans do. Duke just wanted to be near her, wanted to comfort her, and Emma responded to that unconditional support." Rose for cross-examination, and Sarah braced herself. But he seemed oddly hesitant, his questions circling around whether Sarah was projecting her own narrative onto Emma's behavior, whether she'd coached Emma about how to react to the dog. His heart didn't seem to be in it. He kept glancing at Judge as if gauging her reaction. After 5 minutes he sat down, his line of questioning abandoned. "Your Honor, the plaintiff rests," Thomas announced. Judge nodded. "We will now hear from the defense. Counsel, your opening statement." Stood, and his entire demeanor had shifted. He began a measured argument about superior financial resources, his flexible schedule, his commitment to being an involved father. But something had changed in how he was presenting the case. The confidence was gone. The narrative that had seemed so compelling a few hours ago now felt hollow, unconvincing. Sarah found her attention drifting to Emma, who was coloring in a small activity book the bailiff had provided. Her daughter's tongue poked out slightly in concentration as she carefully colored within the lines of a butterfly. This was what it was all about: Emma's safety, Emma's happiness. Everything else was noise. Then's attorney called to the stand. Looked composed and well-prepared as he was sworn in. He recounted his narrative, his flexibility at work, his involvement in Emma's activities, his concern about Sarah's career ambitions superseding her maternal instincts. He spoke eloquently about wanting to provide stability and presence for his daughter. Thomas stood for cross-examination, and Sarah could sense the shift in his body language. He'd found something, some inconsistency, some weakness in his testimony. But before he could ask his first question, something unexpected happened. Emma stood up in the gallery. It wasn't a gradual movement. It was sudden and emphatic. The little girl set down her coloring book and stood upright, her small face serious and intent. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at her. Sarah's heart began to race. Something was happening. "Emma," Sarah said gently, reaching toward her daughter. "Honey, sit down." But Emma ignored her mother. She was staring directly on the witness stand. Then she pointed, the same decisive, purposeful point she'd made at Duke, and she said, in a voice that seemed impossibly clear and determined for a 3-year-old, "Good boy." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Sarah felt confusion wash through her. What was Emma saying? Why was she calling her father a good boy? Then Emma added 2 more words. "Daddy hurts." The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like the entire room had been vacuum sealed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Pen stopped mid-scratch. Judge sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Emma. His face had gone completely white, not blushed, not flushed, but white, as if all blood had drained from his features. His hands, which had been resting on the witness stand arms, began to tremble visibly. "What did you say?" Judge asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a thunderclap. "Daddy hurts," Emma repeated, her voice smaller now but still steady, still certain. She looked confused, as if she didn't understand why everyone had stopped moving, why the room had frozen. She climbed down from the gallery bench and toddled toward Sarah, burying her face in her mother's chest. Sarah felt her entire world tilt on its axis. Her arms came around Emma automatically, protectively, even as her mind struggled to process what her daughter had just said. "Daddy hurts." The words echoed in her mind, taking on terrible significance. All the behavioral changes, all the anxiety, all the pieces she'd been struggling to understand suddenly seemed to align into a horrifying pattern. Was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Sit down," Judge said coldly, not taking her eyes off Emma. "Bailiff, I need you to immediately contact Child Protective Services. We need a forensic interviewer here as quickly as possible. This proceeding is adjourned pending investigation." She turned to look at, and her expression was one of absolute contempt. "Mister, you will remain in this courtroom. Court officers, please ensure he doesn't leave this building." As chaos erupted, court officers moving, lawyers conferring frantically, people whispering urgently, Sarah held her daughter, her mind reeling. Emma had said those words so clearly, so deliberately. Not in anger, not as a complaint about discipline or normal parental correction, but with a weight that suggested something far darker. "It's okay, baby," Sarah whispered to Emma, though she had no idea if that was true. "You're safe now. Mommy's got you." But as she held her daughter, Sarah's mind raced through months of moments she dismissed, overlooked, or attributed to custody battle stress. The way Emma flinched when reached for her sometimes, the specific areas Emma avoided having touched, the way she'd regressed in potty training specifically during visits with her father, the nightmares where she cried about bad touches. 2 simple words from a 3-year-old had just blown open the entire case, revealing something infinitely darker than a custody dispute. And Sarah realized, with sickening clarity, that she hadn't been fighting just to keep her daughter. She'd been fighting, unknowingly, for her daughter's safety and innocence. The next 40 minutes were a blur of official action that moved with surprising efficiency once Judge had activated the emergency protocols. 2 Child Protective Services investigators arrived within 15 minutes, accompanied by a forensic child psychologist named Dr. Miranda. They moved through the courthouse like a coordinated unit, professional and grim, understanding that time was critical in cases involving potential child abuse. Sarah watched them enter the courtroom, felt their eyes assess the situation, and understood with bone-deep certainty that her life, and Emma's, had just fundamentally changed. "Ms. Doctor said, approaching Sarah with a kind but serious expression. She was a woman in her mid-50s with dark eyes that conveyed both compassion and unwavering determination. "My name is Dr. Miranda. I'm a forensic child psychologist, and I need to conduct an interview with Emma. This is a standard procedure in cases where a child has disclosed potential abuse. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded numbly. She didn't trust herself to speak. Emma had gone very still against her chest, sensing the shift in the room's energy, understanding on some primal level that something significant had happened. "Will you be able to release Emma to our care for approximately 1 hour?" Doctor asked. "We have a specially equipped interview room here in the courthouse. It's designed to be non-threatening and comfortable for children. We also have a therapy dog who can be present during the interview if that would help Emma feel safe." Sarah's head snapped up. "Duke." "We have another therapy dog," Doctor clarified. "His name is, and she's trained specifically for forensic interviews with children. However, if Emma is familiar with Duke and if Officer is available, we can request his presence. Animals often help children disclose traumatic information more easily." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was watching the doctor with wide, uncertain eyes. "Emma, honey, these nice people need to talk to you about things. Is that okay? And there will be a nice dog there too." Emma's lower lip trembled. "Will you be there?" "I'll be right outside, sweetheart. I'll be able to see you through a window. You won't be alone." The interview room was nothing like Sarah had imagined. It wasn't clinical or cold. Instead, it was decorated like a comfortable living room, with soft carpet, cushioned furniture and toys scattered invitingly on shelves. There was a small child-sized table and 2 chairs. A camera was discreetly mounted in the corner, and Sarah later learned that she could observe from an adjacent room with one-way glass. Officer had been contacted, and he arrived with Duke within 20 minutes, understanding the gravity of the situation. When Emma saw the golden retriever, her entire body visibly relaxed. She reached out tentatively and touched Duke's head, and the dog responded by gently pressing against her leg, as if offering support. "Okay, Emma," Doctor said gently, settling into one of the child-sized chairs. Duke lay down at Emma's feet, and the little girl's hand rested on his soft fur. "I need to ask you some questions about when you're with your daddy. Is that okay?" Emma nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Duke. "Can you tell me what you meant when you said Daddy hurts?" Doctor asked carefully, her voice gentle but direct. "Where does Daddy hurt you?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a fragmented way that broke Sarah's heart, she began to speak. Her language was limited, she was only 3, but it was devastatingly clear. She talked about her private parts hurting. She described times when her father had told her to keep secrets. She mentioned being scared and not wanting to tell because Daddy said everybody does this, and that it was their special secret. Sarah watched from the observation room, her hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Thomas stood beside her, his face darkening with each word Emma spoke. A court-appointed victim advocate stood on her other side, quietly documenting everything. Doctor continued with careful, age-appropriate questions, never leading Emma, never suggesting answers, simply allowing the child to express what had happened in her own words. As Emma spoke, she occasionally stroked Duke's fur, and the dog remained perfectly still, providing silent comfort. "Has this happened more than once?" Doctor asked. Emma nodded. Many times. Another nod. When was the last time Daddy hurt you? Emma's face crumpled. Last weekend, at his house. I didn't want to go, but Mommy said I had to. Sarah felt her knees buckle. She'd forced Emma to go to those visits, not understanding why her daughter had become so resistant. She'd thought it was normal custody battle anxiety. She'd been trying to be reasonable, trying not to alienate Emma from her father, trying to follow the court orders. And the entire time, Emma had been suffering. The interview lasted 45 minutes. At the end, Doctor gave Emma a special stuffed animal from the office, a soft purple elephant, and told her she'd been very brave. Emma clung to it like a lifeline. After Emma was released back to Sarah, a pediatric examination was scheduled. A doctor specializing in child abuse cases conducted a careful, thorough medical examination in a private clinic adjacent to the courthouse. Sarah remained in the room, holding Emma's hand throughout. The doctor documented physical findings consistent with child sexual abuse. The evidence, though heartbreaking, was clear and undeniable. By late afternoon, Sarah found herself in a conference room with Dr., the CPS investigators, a detective from the police department's Special Victims Unit, and Thomas. The evidence was laid out methodically, professionally, with all the emotion of a clinical presentation, which somehow made it worse. Based on Emma's disclosure and the medical findings, the detective, a woman named Sergeant Wells, said quietly, "We have sufficient evidence to file charges. We'll be seeking a warrant for arrest." "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "We'll need formal statements from you," Sergeant Wells explained. "We'll need to review any documentation you have, school records, medical records, behavioral documentation. We'll interview anyone who's had contact with Emma during the relevant time period. We'll be building a comprehensive case." "And Emma," Sarah asked, "what about her?" "Emma will need trauma counseling," Doctor said gently. "What she's experienced is serious, and the healing process will take time. I'd recommend ongoing therapy, potentially with a trauma specialist. We also recommend maintaining the connection with therapy animals. They've proven incredibly helpful in her case." Thomas leaned forward. "What about the custody case?" "It stayed indefinitely," Judge had announced before adjourning court. "Pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, Mr. will not have any unsupervised contact with the minor pending trial." In the days that followed, was arrested and charged with child sexual abuse. His attorney immediately began damage control, claiming the allegations were fabricated, that they were a product of Sarah's manipulation. But the evidence told a different story. Medical findings, forensic interview documentation, behavioral documentation from school, it all corroborated Emma's disclosure. Sarah moved through the following weeks in a state of protective intensity. She enrolled Emma in therapy with a trauma specialist who worked with other children who'd experienced abuse. The therapist recommended that Emma continue with Officer and Duke. The animals had become part of her healing process. Twice a week, Emma would sit with Duke, and through the animal's patient presence, she began processing what had happened to her. The guilt that consumed Sarah was almost paralyzing. She'd missed the signs. She'd been so focused on fighting for custody that she'd been blind to the reality of what her daughter was experiencing. But Thomas and Doctor gently reminded her repeatedly that victims of child abuse are deliberately trained by their abusers to keep secrets, that children Emma's age often lack the language to disclose, that she'd done everything right in the end. "You got her to safety," Doctor told Sarah during a consultation. "You trusted her when she finally found the words to tell you. You didn't minimize or dismiss her. In my experience, that's what separates children who heal from children who carry lifelong trauma without intervention." But Sarah couldn't shake the knowledge that Emma had suffered while she'd been fighting a custody case, completely unaware of the reality behind her daughter's anxiety. Emma's words in that courtroom, "Daddy hurts," had been the first crack in a terrible facade. And now, as the system mobilized to protect her, Sarah understood that her fight had never really been about winning a custody battle. It had been about survival. The investigation into unfolded like the methodical removal of layers from a rotten onion. Each layer exposed something more disturbing than the last, revealing a pattern of calculated abuse that had been systematically hidden behind a carefully constructed image of devoted fatherhood. Detective Sergeant Wells led the investigation with grim determination, having seen this pattern before in her 12 years working with the Special Victims Unit. She knew that child abusers didn't act impulsively. They groomed their victims, managed their narratives, and cultivated an image of trustworthiness that made their crimes nearly invisible to outsiders. The first break came from Emma's preschool. Sarah had authorized the release of Emma's school records, and Wells requested meetings with the teachers who'd worked with her. The responses were immediate and damning. Emma's primary teacher, Mrs., had documented behavioral changes meticulously, though she'd never connected them to anything sinister until now. "I noticed significant regression about 8 months ago," Mrs. explained to Wells in the school's small office. She pulled out Emma's file and showed the detective detailed notes. Around April of last year, Emma had been fully potty trained, but then she started having accidents again, not just occasional accidents but frequent ones, multiple times per day. She would cry and apologize profusely as if she'd done something terribly wrong. "I noted it as possible regression due to family circumstances, but looking back..." Mrs.'s voice trailed off as she understood the implication. "The accidents were most frequent after custody exchanges. I remember because would pick her up on Fridays, and by Monday morning she'd have had multiple accidents over the weekend. By Wednesday or Thursday, she'd be stabilized again, and then Friday would come and the cycle would repeat." Wells felt the familiar coldness of confirmation. Regression in potty training was a known indicator of trauma in young children, particularly sexual trauma. She made careful notes. "Did you notice any other behavioral changes?" "Several," Mrs. said, flipping through the documentation. Around the same time the regression started, Emma became unusually withdrawn. She stopped participating in group activities. She used to be an incredibly social, joyful child, but after April she would sit alone just watching the other children play. She became clingy with me and the assistant teachers. She didn't want us to leave the room. If we stepped out of her view, she would panic." Wells continued through the file. There were notes about nightmares. Emma had mentioned being scared to sleep. There were incidents where Emma had become distressed during diaper changing and wouldn't allow the teachers to help her clean up after accidents. There was documentation of Emma becoming rigid and fearful whenever men came to the classroom, even the gentle male teacher's assistant who typically worked with the younger kids. "I should have put it together," Mrs. said, her voice thick with emotion. "I documented all of this, but I told myself it was anxiety from the custody situation, from transitions between homes. I never considered." "You documented it," Wells said gently. "That's what matters. You created the record that helps us build the case." The next interviews were with Emma's former babysitter and the nanny who'd cared for her during Sarah's work hours. Both provided consistent observations. Emma was a happy, well-adjusted child during the week, but would become increasingly anxious as Friday approached. The nanny, Martinez, recalled a specific incident from 3 months prior. "She was very upset one Monday morning," remembered. "More upset than usual. I asked her if she was okay and she said her tummy hurt. She wouldn't sit down. She wanted to stand or lay on her tummy all day. I offered to call her mother, but Emma begged me not to, said she didn't want to make mommy sad." It was such an odd thing for a 3-year-old to say. She was in pain about something but trying to protect her mother from knowing. Doctor, the forensic psychologist, explained the significance during her consultation with the detective. Children who are sexually abused often try to protect their abusers, particularly when the abuser is a parent or authority figure. They've been trained through grooming to believe that the abuse is normal, that they're complicit, that disclosure will result in negative consequences. Emma trying to hide her distress from her mother isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of how effectively she was manipulated. The medical evidence was compiled by Dr. James, a pediatrician specializing in child abuse cases. His examination documented genital trauma consistent with digital penetration and sexual contact. He photographed the findings with clinical precision and prepared detailed medical reports. He also noted Emma's medical history, a urinary tract infection diagnosed 3 months prior that had been treated with antibiotics. According to his analysis, this infection was consistent with sexual contact. The UTI is particularly significant, doctor explained to Wells. Parents sometimes bring children in with UTIs after abuse, often without understanding the connection. The mother brought Emma in, reported the symptoms, and the pediatrician at the time treated it symptomatically without considering the potential cause. It's a common missed opportunity for intervention. Wells compiled a timeline. The behavioral changes had begun approximately 8 months before Emma's courtroom disclosure, coinciding almost exactly with the beginning of push for increased custody. The regression had worsened as gained more unsupervised overnight visitations. The anxiety had become pronounced in the weeks before scheduled visits. The pattern was unmistakable. She obtains phone records and discovered something chilling. Search history on his personal computer included searches for how to teach children about private parts and normal childhood development sexuality. The searches had been conducted over a year ago, before the custody battle had even begun. Combined with other evidence, they suggested premeditation rather than impulsive behavior. Wells also discovered that had been involved in a previous custody dispute with an ex-girlfriend approximately 5 years prior. When she tracked down that woman, the story was eerily similar. The ex-girlfriend's daughter, now 9 years old and living with her mother full-time, had exhibited behavioral changes during custody time. That child had never explicitly disclosed abuse, but she'd refused all contact with. The ex-girlfriend, not understanding the gravity of the situation, had attributed it to typical childhood defiance. "I should have fought harder," the ex-girlfriend told Wells, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known something was wrong. She used to cry when he'd pick her up, and I just thought it was normal separation anxiety, if I'd known what he was doing." The pattern, when examined comprehensively, suggested a predator who had carefully selected victims, groomed them systematically, and cultivated protective narratives that prevented disclosure. Sarah's custody battle had been the perfect opportunity. A distracted mother focused on legal proceedings, a child caught in the middle of conflict, a pathway to increased unsupervised time. The prosecutors building the case against worked methodically. They had Emma's forensic interview, recorded and preserved. They had medical documentation. They had behavioral documentation from schools spanning months. They had the ex-girlfriend's testimony about her own daughter's unexplained anxiety around. They had search history suggesting premeditation. They had a clear timeline correlating behavioral changes to increased custody time. But it was the video of Emma's courtroom statement that would prove most powerful during trial preparation. The prosecutors watched the footage repeatedly, seeing that moment of clarity, that point where a 3-year-old's words had cut through months of legal maneuvering and complex arguments to reveal a simple, terrible truth. During a meeting with Sarah to prepare her for her testimony, one of the prosecutors, a woman named Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Hayes, explained the significance. "What you have is rare and powerful. Most child abuse cases rely on indirect evidence and expert testimony. This case has direct disclosure from the victim, contemporaneous documentation from multiple sources, medical evidence, and behavioral evidence all pointing to the same conclusion. Defense will be denial, but the evidence is overwhelming." Sarah listened to all of this from a place of deep emotional shock. She'd been so focused on winning custody that she'd missed the reality of her daughter's suffering. She'd believed she was fighting for Emma's when Emma had actually needed immediate protection. The guilt was a constant weight, even as professionals assured her repeatedly that she wasn't at fault, that abusers are deliberately deceptive, that she'd done the right thing once Emma disclosed. Thomas had explained during one consultation, "You trusted your daughter. You didn't minimize her. You immediately sought professional help. You did everything right once you understood the situation. The tragedy is that you didn't understand earlier, but that's not a failure on your part. That's a success for deception." Still, Sarah couldn't shake the knowledge that Emma had suffered in silence while she'd been battling in courtrooms. And now, as the criminal case was being built against, Sarah threw herself into the process, determined that every piece of evidence would be pursued, every avenue explored, every detail documented. Because if Emma's suffering was going to mean anything, it had to mean that never hurt another child again. The arrest warrant for was executed at his office on a Wednesday morning in October, 6 months after Emma's courtroom disclosure. Detective Wells and 2 uniformed officers entered the real estate development firm where maintained his executive suite. His employees watched in shocked silence as he was informed of his rights and escorted out in handcuffs. The photographs made it into the local news. A respected businessman, a man who'd positioned himself as a devoted father, suddenly revealed as something else entirely. His defense strategy became immediately clear: deny everything. His attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Robert Kingston, filed motions claiming that the allegations were fabricated, that Emma had been coached by Sarah to make the statements, that the medical findings were inconclusive, that the behavioral documentation was subjective interpretation. Kingston was good, excellent, actually, but he was fighting against a mountain of corroborating evidence that all pointed in the same direction. The prosecutorial team, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Hayes, built their case methodically. They had organized consultations with child trauma experts, forensic medical specialists, and behavioral psychologists. Doctor prepared comprehensive expert testimony about the grooming process, the psychology of child abuse victims, and the significance of Emma's disclosure patterns. Doctor prepared detailed medical testimony with photographs and clinical findings. Teachers and caregivers prepared to testify about documented behavioral changes. But the cornerstone of the prosecution's case remained Emma herself. This presented Sarah with an almost unbearable dilemma. Emma would need to testify, not live in the courtroom, which would be, but via recorded video deposition. Sarah would have to help prepare her daughter to articulate, again, the abuse she'd suffered. The thought of putting Emma through additional questioning, of forcing her to relive those traumatic moments, made Sarah physically ill. "I won't put her through this," Sarah told Jennifer Hayes during a consultation. "There has to be another way. You have enough evidence. You don't need Emma to testify." "Technically, you're right," Hayes acknowledged gently. "We have sufficient evidence to proceed without Emma's testimony. However, her testimony is powerful and direct. It carries weight that expert testimony, no matter how comprehensive, cannot match. A jury will hear from the victim in her own words." "She's 3 years old," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "She shouldn't have to be a lawyer or a witness. She should just be allowed to heal." "I know," Hayes said, and her compassion seemed genuine. "That's why we'll make it as gentle as possible. Doctor will be present during the deposition. It will be conducted in a comfortable setting, not a courtroom. Emma can have her therapy dog present. We'll use language she understands. We'll take breaks whenever she needs them. And we'll prepare her thoroughly so she knows what to expect." Preparing Emma for the deposition became a collaborative effort involving doctor, officer, and Sarah. They used a process called preparation therapy, where Emma was gradually acclimated to the idea of telling her story to new people. Duke remained a constant presence throughout. The dog had become Emma's emotional anchor, the living symbol of safety and support. In the weeks leading up to the deposition, Emma's behavioral improvements became noticeable. She was sleeping better, eating better, showing increased engagement with her world. The therapy that had been ongoing with Doctor, combined with the consistent presence of therapy animals and the security of knowing her father would not be able to contact her, had allowed Emma's nervous system to begin healing. Trauma in young children is somewhat different than in older children or adults, Doctor explained to Sarah. Very young children don't have the cognitive framework to construct complex narratives about their experiences, but they respond remarkably well to safety, consistency, and therapeutic support. Emma is beginning to process what happened to her not as something she caused or was responsible for, but simply as something that occurred, something that happened to her, but didn't define her. The deposition took place in a specially equipped room at the district attorney's office. Emma sat at a small table with Doctor, while Duke lay beside her on a cushion. A camera positioned discreetly in the corner would record her statements. On the other side of a one-way mirror, Sarah watched, her heart in her throat. Assistant District Attorney Hayes conducted the questioning with remarkable gentleness, using language appropriate for a 3-year-old, never leading, never suggesting answers. She simply asked Emma to tell her about times with Daddy, about the things that made her sad or scared or hurt. Emma's account was fragmented, as had been the forensic interview months earlier, but it was consistent. She described physical sensations, pain in her private parts. She described being told to keep secrets. She described her father saying that all daddies do this with their little girls. She described times when she wanted him to stop, but he wouldn't. She described hiding in the bathroom afterward. It was heartbreaking and devastating, and absolutely necessary. The deposition lasted 2 hours with multiple breaks. Emma grew tired and emotional, but Duke remained by her side, and with the dog's presence she found the courage to continue. When it was finally complete, Hayes thanked Emma formally for her bravery. Emma, clearly relieved that the questioning was over, immediately buried her face against Duke's neck. The protective order hearing happened in November, 3 months after Emma's courtroom disclosure. Judge presided again, and there was never any doubt about the outcome. Was ordered to have absolutely no contact with Emma, direct or indirect. He was prohibited from contacting Sarah except through his attorney regarding the criminal case. He was restricted from the school Emma attended, from any location Emma frequented. The custody case was formally transferred to the jurisdiction of the family court judge handling the criminal matter, ensuring consistency. Full custody is awarded to Sarah, judge announced. The minor child will remain in the custody and care of her mother, with visitation with the father suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings and any subsequent family therapy or rehabilitation deemed appropriate by the court. Sarah felt Emma's small hand squeeze hers as the judge spoke. Her daughter had been safe legally before, but now it was official, formalized, protected by the power of the court system. The criminal trial was scheduled for April of the following year, 6 months away. The waiting period was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed Emma more time to heal, more time to establish stability and safety, but it also meant prolonged uncertainty, continued legal proceedings, and the knowledge that remained incarcerated pending trial, his continued presence in their lives and ongoing legal entanglement. Sarah threw herself into supporting Emma's healing. She maintained the therapy sessions with Doctor twice weekly. She coordinated with Officer to ensure Emma's continued participation in the formal Pause and Peace program, which had expanded significantly after Emma's case received attention from local media outlets. Parents across the county were suddenly interested in trauma-informed animal therapy for their children. Other parents began coming forward. Quietly, carefully, they contacted CPS or law enforcement with concerns about their own children. One mother reported that her daughter had been with during his marriage to Sarah and had exhibited similar behavioral changes. Another woman mentioned her sister's daughter, who'd also shown inexplicable anxiety around years earlier. Investigators followed these leads methodically. Within 3 months, additional victims had come forward, 3 other girls in total, ranging in age from 4 to 7 years old. Each had experienced abuse from during times when he had custody or unsupervised access. Each showed similar behavioral patterns, similar medical findings, similar disclosure reluctance. The prosecutors immediately expanded the charges. What had begun as a single case against for abusing Emma transformed into a comprehensive prosecution involving multiple victims spanning several years. The scope of his predation became increasingly apparent as investigators connected the dots, traced the patterns, identified the grooming behaviors. "This is a serial child predator," Jennifer Hayes told Sarah during one of their numerous consultations. "He selected his victims carefully, young children from troubled families, custody disputes, situations where he could gain unsupervised access. He groomed them systematically. He manipulated their parents. He controlled narratives through careful image management. And when a relationship ended, he simply moved on to his next victim." Sarah felt sickened but also grimly determined. Emma had not only saved herself, she had potentially saved other children. Her courage in that courtroom, those 2 words spoken in innocence and clarity, had triggered an investigation that was now protecting multiple children from ongoing harm. Emma began to understand, in her limited way, that what had happened to her wasn't her fault. Through gentle, age-appropriate therapy, she began to process the trauma not as shame or responsibility, but as something that had been done to her by someone who was supposed to protect her but hadn't. "You were so brave," Sarah would tell her daughter regularly. "You were brave when you told the judge about Duke. You were brave when you talked to Doctor, and now other people are safe because you were brave." Emma didn't fully comprehend this, but she seemed to understand that something important had happened, that her words mattered, that she had somehow helped. And in that understanding, something shifted in her healing trajectory. By spring, as the trial approached, Emma was noticeably different from the anxious, withdrawn child of 6 months prior. She was animated again, joyful, engaged with her world. She still had moments of sadness and fear. That was normal for a child who'd experienced trauma. But the constant anxiety, the pervasive sense of danger, had begun to lift. Sarah understood that Emma's healing journey would be lifelong, that there would be difficult moments ahead, that the trauma would likely resurface at different developmental stages. But as she watched her daughter play with Duke, laugh genuinely, and talk about her dreams for the future, Sarah felt something that had been absent for months: hope. The criminal trial began on an overcast Monday in April, exactly 1 year after Emma had stood up in Judge's courtroom and spoken those 2 words that changed everything. The courthouse steps were crowded with media personnel, victim advocates, and curious onlookers who'd followed the case through news coverage and social media. What had begun as a local custody dispute had evolved into something far larger, a case that illustrated the systemic failures in protecting children, the power of therapy animals in trauma disclosure, and the remarkable courage of a 3-year-old who'd inadvertently dismantled a carefully constructed facade of deception. Sarah sat in the courtroom gallery with Emma, who was too young to attend in person but would appear via recorded video during the prosecution's presentation of evidence. Emma clutched a small stuffed Duke, a plush toy version of Officer's K9 that had become her comfort object. She didn't fully understand what was happening, only that Mommy said she needed to be here, and that the judge needed to hear what she'd already told Doctor. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. Jennifer Hayes presented the evidence in layers. First, the behavioral documentation from teachers and caregivers, establishing the pattern of regression and anxiety correlating with custody exchanges. Then, the medical evidence from Doctor, presented with clinical precision and photographs that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. Then the expert testimony from child trauma specialists explaining grooming behaviors, disclosure reluctance, and the significance of Emma's disclosure pattern. When Emma's recorded video testimony was played for the jury, the courtroom went absolutely silent. The video showed a small, solemn child sitting with Duke lying protectively beside her. Emma's voice, thin, uncertain, but absolutely clear, articulated her experiences in language a jury could understand. She didn't use clinical terminology. She used the simple, direct language of childhood trauma. It hurt. Daddy said, "Don't tell." I was scared. Several jurors had tears streaming down their faces by the time the video ended. One elderly woman in the back row was openly crying. Robert Kingston's defense was weak. He called character witnesses who to seemingly devoted fatherhood and his involvement in community activities. He attempted to argue that Emma had been coached, that Sarah had fabricated the allegations to win the custody case, that the medical findings were inconclusive. But the sheer volume of corroborating evidence, multiple victims, documented behavioral changes across several years, physical medical findings, search history suggesting premeditation, made his argument sound hollow and desperate. The prosecution called the other 3 victims' testimony, again through recorded video. Each child, now older and somewhat more articulate than Emma had been, described similar patterns of abuse, similar manipulation, similar confusion about what was happening to them. The jury heard from teachers who documented behavioral changes years ago without understanding their significance. They heard from the ex-girlfriend whose daughter had never explicitly disclosed but whose fear of was undeniable. Took the stand in his own defense, a decision his attorney had likely advised against but that apparently insisted upon. He maintained his innocence, claimed the allegations were coordinated conspiracies by bitter ex-partners, suggested that Emma had been manipulated by Sarah. But his demeanor was off. His confidence from the custody hearing had been replaced by something more desperate, more defensive. He seemed unable to maintain the persona of devoted father that had served him so well for years. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict: guilty on all counts, guilty of child sexual abuse, guilty of multiple counts of sexual abuse of children, guilty of engaging in a pattern of abuse spanning years and involving multiple victims. Sarah felt Emma squeeze her hand. The little girl didn't understand what the words meant, but she sensed the shift in the room's energy, the relief, the resolution, the sense of something ending. Judge sentenced to 23 years in prison without possibility of parole. As she delivered the sentence, she looked directly at Sarah and Emma. This court recognizes the extraordinary bravery of the victims in this case, particularly the youngest victim who, despite her age and the limitations of language available to her, found the courage to speak truth. This case demonstrates how systemic failures allowed abuse to continue unchecked. We must do better. In the months following the conviction, Emma's case became the subject of intense professional interest. Forensic psychologists requested copies of doctors' documentation. Law enforcement agencies studied how the therapy dog had facilitated disclosure. Child advocacy organizations began using the case as a model for trauma-informed practice. Officer and Duke were invited to speak at police academies, child protection conferences, and university programs. Detective Wells published a detailed case analysis in a professional journal, documenting the investigative techniques that had been most effective. Her article emphasized how behavioral documentation from schools and providers, when compiled and analyzed for patterns, could reveal abuse that individual observations might miss. The article became required reading in several police academies. The Pause and Peace program that had begun as a pilot initiative in Emma's school district expanded dramatically. After media coverage of Emma's case highlighted the role of therapy animals in disclosure, school districts across the state requested information about implementing similar programs. Within 2 years, 50 schools had formal partnerships with certified therapy animal handlers. Research studies began documenting improved outcomes in trauma-affected children who participated in animal-assisted therapy. Doctor was invited to speak at the American Psychological Association's annual conference about her work with Emma and the other victims. Her presentation became one of the most attended sessions, with standing room-only crowds interested in learning about trauma-informed child interviews and the role of therapeutic animals. Following her presentation, she received numerous invitations to consult on similar cases nationwide. Officer and Duke were featured in several documentary projects about therapy animals and law enforcement innovation. Their work in Emma's case became a model for other police departments seeking to implement K-9 assisted victim support programs. Received a Regional Community Service Award from the police department, presented at a ceremony attended by hundreds of officers. More significantly, his work contributed to new departmental policies about using therapy animals in victim interviews. But perhaps the most significant impact came through policy changes. Advocacy organizations, armed with documentation of Emma's case and others like it, state legislators for changes to mandatory reporting requirements. A new law, eventually named the Emma's Brave Voice Act, required more comprehensive documentation and reporting of behavioral changes in children, particularly in cases involving custody disputes or transitions between households. Teachers, healthcare providers, and workers received updated training on recognizing and reporting potential abuse indicators. Universities began incorporating Emma's case into their curricula. Law schools used it to teach about family law implications of abuse. Psychology programs used it to teach about trauma and disclosure. Nursing programs used it to train healthcare providers to recognize abuse indicators in medical settings. Social work programs used it to teach about systemic failures and how to intervene more effectively. Emma herself remained largely unaware of this broader impact. She knew only that she'd been brave, that people said she'd helped other children, that she got to spend time with Duke, and that she was safe now. By her 4th birthday, a year after his conviction, Emma had transformed. She was joyful, animated, full of typical childhood exuberance. She still attended therapy sessions with Doctor twice monthly, not because she was struggling significantly, but because continued therapeutic support was recommended for children who'd experienced trauma. Duke remained a regular presence in her life. Officer had become a trusted adult figure, someone Emma greeted enthusiastically at school events and community gatherings. Sarah watched her daughter flourish and felt gratitude mixed with ongoing sadness about what Emma had endured. She'd also her own therapy, working through the guilt, the self-blame, and the complex feelings about having been married to a predator for 12 years. Her therapist reminded her repeatedly that she was not responsible for his choices, that she'd responded appropriately once Emma disclosed, that she'd become Emma's fiercest advocate. On the 1-year anniversary of Emma's courtroom disclosure, Officer brought Duke to Emma's preschool for a special celebration. The school had declared it Emma's Brave Voices Day, honoring not just Emma but all the children in their school community who'd experienced trauma and found courage to disclose. Emma received a certificate of bravery presented by the school principal, while Duke sat proudly beside her. Emma didn't keep the certificate. She was 4 years old and certificates meant little to her. But she kept the memory of being celebrated, of being seen as brave, of understanding that her words had mattered. Years later, when Emma was older and better able to comprehend what had happened to her, when she understood the scope of her father's crimes and the broader impact of her disclosure, she would process these experiences through the lens of a survivor. But that understanding would come later. For now, at 4 years old, Emma simply knew that she was safe, that she was loved, that she had a dog named Duke who made her feel brave, and that telling the truth had made a difference. The ripple effects of Emma's case continued to spread. Training programs incorporated her story. Policy reform saved unknown numbers of children from abuse. Therapy animal programs expanded. Law enforcement agencies refined their approaches to child victim interviews. Schools became more attentive to behavioral changes as indicators of possible abuse. All of this began with one small girl pointing at a dog and speaking two words that cracked open a carefully constructed facade. As Sarah tucked Emma into bed one evening, her daughter asked a question that encapsulated the complexity of everything that had happened. "Mommy, why did Daddy hurt me?" Sarah had been prepared for this question by Doctor. She answered carefully, age-appropriately, honestly. Because Daddy had something wrong inside him that made him do bad things. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't anything you did. And the important thing is that you're safe now, and people are making sure other children are safe too. Emma nodded solemnly, processing this in her 4-year-old way. Then she said, "I'm glad Duke was there." "So am I, baby," Sarah whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "So am I." Outside, in the darkness, the world continued to change incrementally because of one child's courage. The systems designed to protect children were slowly improving. Other victims were finding voice and support. Other abuse patterns were being identified and interrupted. And it had all begun because a 3-year-old girl had recognized a friend and found the courage to speak truth.